It's the overview of the history of African cultural astronomy research. Here's an outline of my talk. Everyone's with me? That's kind of fast transition. Okay, I'll start with an overview, then I'll present the cultural astronomy definitions, theories that are currently circulating in the field, data collection methods. I'll talk about eclipses in Africa, and then we'll discuss the details of this conference. So I've worked my hardest since 1997 to collect everything that's ever been printed on African astronomy and culture. And that of which I've analyzed in some detail about 60, and I've analyzed more lightly about 300 items. So the graphs that you're going to see range between items that are 180 or so up to 278, somewhere between 150 and 300 items. And this is the breakdown of 271 of those items that I have. Most of them are secondary articles, some are field notes. And the first bar captures all of the 18th century. So it's 1800 to 1900. And you see it's a very small bar. And I've broken down the colors of those bars to three groups: Egyptians, Dogons, and others. So you see that the first 100 years for African cultural astronomy research, it's dominated by articles on Egypt. Then, as you go along, you see the Egyptian bars go up and down, and you see the first emergence of the Dogon bar. And of course, that's an article by Marcel Grial, who I'll discuss in some detail later. But here we are today. We're halfway through this decade, and we're not doing too badly. But we still have this peak that happened in 1990. But that peak is almost artificial, because most of these articles were surveys of those articles. There was not very much original research going on in the 1990s, but a lot of people were talking about other people's research done in the past. And 2000, this is 1990, this is 1980 to 90, this is 1990 to 2000. And that's when I started to publish again. I started doing original research on celestial navigation among Africans in North Africa. This is 283 articles, and this is a breakdown of basically the library by country, what's represented and what isn't. So in this collection, there's 56 African nations, and 41 are represented. Egypt has the largest line, but I actually separated out the Dogon from Mali. So if I put the Dogon back in Mali, it'll probably be equivalent to Egypt. Definitions. So here's our fine definition that was written in 97 by him, Nick Campion. The study of the use of astronomical knowledge, beliefs, or theories to inspire, inform, or influence social forms and ideologies or any aspect of human behavior. Cultural astronomy also includes the modern disciplines of ethnoastronomy and archaeoastronomy. So according to Nick Campion, cultural astronomy is related to everything, right? Because this grabs everything, which is wonderful if you're writing a grant, right? This is a great definition, but it doesn't really tell you what we do. So we have to go to the definitions of what ethnoastronomy and archaeoastronomy are in order to get more of an understanding of what we actually do as cultural astronomers. So reading the definition for ethnoastronomy, the study of the knowledge, interpretations, and practices of contemporary cultures regarding celestial objects or phenomena. The difference between these two definitions is one says contemporary, and the other one says ancient. That's the only difference between those two definitions. But what this has is methodological implications. You're studying either people who are alive today or not. There's been a debate on what to call the astronomy of the people. Do you call it indigenous astronomy or modern astronomy, contemporary astronomy? But the debate that I'm pointing to here is the debate between indigenous and endogenous astronomy. And those are the formal definitions that are there. So is it African indigenous astronomy, African endogenous astronomy? And the difference between the two is quite subtle. So for the top one, we have originating or living or occurring naturally in an area or environment. It's just out there. So you have indigenous astronomy is just out there. Whereas endogenous is produced or growing from within, which means that it's something that's created by something. So when I give this talk to physicists, how many physicists? Thank you. How many physicists are in the room, by the way? Physics students? Okay, not so many today. Okay, usually when I give this slide to physicists, they like, let me figure this out. They like indigenous. And this fits in with our concept of how science is done. That there's rules of natures out there and rules of behavior out there, and the scientist is just trying to figure out what those rules are, okay? So they're observing something that's out there intrinsically, and they're trying to make sense of it. Whereas endogenous implies more of an agency, that there's an interplay between nature and man. So you pick which one you like, but I just wanted to put those there because you're going to hear both of them depending on who's presenting. They have their favorite one. Some will say African indigenous astronomy, and some will say African endogenous astronomy. And this is something that we can debate more in the workshops. When I was a baby cultural astronomer, I divided my library roughly into 9 categories down here. And this is the way it broke down in those 9 categories. And you may wonder what this very tall spike is. That's artifacts and tools. Now, my library came from 4 sources, but one of those sources was an art historian of Africa. And by far, she had the largest library, which she gave to me. So I think that the fact that we have a spike there is artificial because that was her area of interest. And so when I started doing analysis, of course, that's how it came out. But what I've been doing since I was a baby cultural astronomer, now I'm a big cultural astronomer, is I've been refining those 9 categories. As I do more detailed analysis of the materials that I have, those categories have broken down into subcategories. So for my project on navigation by the stars, it started out a broad category called stellar navigation, and then there's something called star path navigation that happens in the tropics. And then we have stellar navigation by the stars and using by Polaris. And then we have wind roses, which are also used for navigation. So that kind of breakdown happened. So 9 quickly turned into 33. And now my task is to try to standardize what do these quotations mean. So I've gone into articles and I pulled out chunks of articles and I've classified it. I've coded it to these subcategories. And now I have to standardize it some way before I can move forward with this analysis. Theories that are currently circulating in African cultural astronomy. This is the one where we can all laugh. African astronomy can be broadly classified continent-wide. The implications of this are that African cultural astronomy is independent of geography, climate, culture, latitude, and the colonial experience. Do you believe it? Another theory is Egyptian diffusion theory, which is that all astronomy in Africa owes most of it to Egypt. So it's diffused from ancient Egypt. Another theory, that some of the astronomy found in West Africa is has been transferred from Islamic astronomy. So you find elements of Islamic astronomy in non-Islamic cultures in West Africa. Then there's Hamlet's Mill, which was a book that was published in 1969. And this book looked at some of the ancient myths and some of the religions, and they came to the theory and perhaps the conclusion that almost all religions and myths have some basis in astronomy. I want to get rid of this. Another theory that's circulating about African cultural astronomy is that most of the alignments that you find primarily serve a calendar function. Come on. There we go. So those theories, the people who are invited to the Scholars Workshop are going to start analyzing and debunking and throwing away and coming up with new theories to work with for the next 10 or 15 years. So the next section of my talk is methods of data collection in African cultural astronomy.